My name is Tom Harris, and this is Exploratory Journeys. Well, good evening. This is Tom Harris with Exploratory Journeys. Tonight we have an interesting guest, Nicholas Lapierre. Hi, Nick. How are you? Welcome to the studio.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's an honor to be here and a privilege.
Yeah, well, it's great. Nicholas, can you tell me, where did you come from originally?
My mother's womb, and that was in the Ottawa Valley at the time. I'm Ottawa born and bred.
Yeah. We have Nicholas in here because he's an advocate, a disciple, you might say, of followership, and we'll get into that in a second. He's also the president, or past president, of our Toastmasters Club, Constellation Toastmasters. We'll talk about that as well. But, getting first of all into your background, you were born and brought up in Ottawa, I take it?
I certainly was. It's a great opportunity and a great city to be from, and to continue to live in as well, I should say.
Yeah, and you have you're married with three kids?
No, two human children, and then we have a fur baby as well. So we've got a cockapoo as well.
Oh, okay, yeah, we got a cockapoo too. Yeah, they're crazy, eh?
Yes, and we are crazy for having it, I'd say.
Yeah. Now, followership, that's kind of an interesting topic. We hear about leadership all the time. What is followership?
Well, followership is just the next continuation of what leadership is. So every time you think of there being a leader, you need to have followers. And the question that I think we're lacking in society is what can we do to ensure that the followers we have are empowered and that we individuals understand the value of what it is to be a follower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we're constantly bombarded with the importance of leadership. But without the electorate, there's no leaders. Mm-hmm. And of course, it makes me wonder, followers are not people who are just mindless serfs, right?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
The biggest thing that I think people get confused with the idea of being a follower. They usually associate it as a negative thing. But if you really want to look at it, whenever you're following something, you're lending weight to what you are following. Mm-hmm. One of the biggest things that I can come up with is if you look at Twitter, or if you look at Facebook, Instagram, the people that have the greatest voice are the people with the greatest number of followers. Mm-hmm. So every time you follow something, every time that you give part of your attention to something, you're giving that individual a greater platform. Mm-hmm. And I think people really need to understand what that means in the larger context. Mm-hmm. You can look at that as simple as social media. What's getting more likes? What's getting more exposure? How's it getting more exposure? It's because you're telling the algorithms that you think this is important, so other people as well too.
Yeah.
And
so is there formal training in followership, or how?
That's what I'm working on.
Oh, okay. So what are you trying to do? You're trying to convince people that they can be followers while still being themselves and actually contribute, not just be, as I say, a mindless serf.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one of the biggest things that we have to understand is following is not a bad thing. Mm-hmm. One of the greatest things I like to say is, follow your dreams. It's something I tell my children. But right there, that's the whole idea. It's to follow your dreams. Mm-hmm. It's not lead your dreams. It's follow them. It's understanding what it is that you want to spend your time in. We all have a limited amount of attention that we can give to some things. For instance, right now on Twitter, I don't know what kind of your Twitter account you have or social media accounts you have, but you are probably following far more than you can actually keep up with all by yourself.
You're not kidding.
And so I would challenge people to say, well, why are you following so many things? Why aren't you following just the most important things and giving that the attention that it deserves?
So followers then, you would hope, would buy into the mantra, so to speak, of the leader. In other words, you can't have followers who don't support the mission, right? Isn't that an important part?
Absolutely, yes. So whenever we think of the olden days, you'd have people who would endorse a political candidate. And whenever you have someone who has an endorsement, you think, I trust that person. It's a valued sort of opinion that I have. I will lend my vote. I will lend my voice to empower this other individual.
Yeah.
And that's what followership in many ways can be.
Yeah. I get the impression that a lot of times when people are left-wing or right-wing or whatever they are, that they have a tendency to be unthinking followers of a laundry list of ideals, and they basically agree or disagree with points of view based on what they're expected to. So that's not really what that's not the ideal kind of follower, is it?
Absolutely not. I think in any organization, you want somebody who believes in what the mission is. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that will come into contrast with a direction to be able to achieve that vision. And I think that's where followers really have an opportunity to step up. Now, some people would say, well, you're blurring the lines between being a follower and being a leader. Sometimes it's a question of position. Sometimes it's a question of authority. And sometimes it's a question of knowing the difference of how you can be in an organization.
So it must be fairly difficult for some leaders to encourage their followers without actually encouraging them to challenge their leadership. You know, that would be something that would be tricky, I would think.
Well, and this is where a lot of the leadership trajectory has changed over time. Leadership writing is over 2,000 years old. I mean, the ancient Greeks spoke about it. The ancient Chinese civilization spoke about it. And there's been this unique sort of direction to be able to disseminate power from a single individual into the masses. That's where you have things like democracy coming in. I think, to quote Churchill, it's the worst form of government with the exception of all others. But by able to say that if you can give people the opportunity to make the choice, you're empowering them to make the right choices. And together we can make a better choice when we work together. And if you want to look at, from a corporate example, usually whenever you have an organization that wants to sell something, it's going to say, okay, well, what's going to sell? They don't just say, this is what we're selling, buy it. I mean, whenever that happens, the reality then becomes people won't buy it, and those organizations become in trouble. Look at the car companies. They had a real challenge, and it's because they were building things that people weren't buying.
And way out of price, which is part of the reason that they weren't buying it.
Yeah. And so what they should have done is they should have followed the lead of the customer, as opposed to saying, this is the way we expect the industry to go. They could have been more responsive by looking at the cues that were being offered to them.
So it sounds like being a proper leader requires actually polling your followers to see where they're going before you actually make some of your decisions. Some people would say that's a weakness, but it doesn't sound like it.
Well, I would say not. There's a new theory when it comes to leadership called servant leadership. And the idea is that as a manager, as a boss, your real opportunity is to remove the obstacles for your staff. And that's bringing the power back into the individual, into us as the people who are following. And that should trickle all the way down. And I would say if you think of a pyramid as being any type of organization you're working for, you have more people working, and then you have a layer of management, and then slowly you sharpen that pyramid to the very top. But even at the very top, that person has an obligation to follow everything that falls down from it. If the base of that organization doesn't agree, the person at the top can't stay long.
Yeah.
And even if you wanted to look at it from the opposite point of view, even the person at the very top of that organization, as we discussed before, if they don't have the support of the community that they're supposed to be able to sell their products to, or the people that they're being responsible to beyond their organization, they will not last long. Because let's say a board of governors will remove a CEO. There are always opportunities to understand that although you are the leader, you have an opportunity and an obligation to follow what a certain key path is.
And it seems to me a lot of bosses that I've had have trouble with the idea that the individual can contribute with, like I've had many autocratic bosses where you got to the point where you were afraid to make suggestions. And as a consequence, projects went awry. So, I mean, that surely is quite a challenge to get the follower to not feel afraid, but to respect the authority. How do you do that?
Well, I think that's one of the biggest reasons why people have to work with those in an authoritative position, is we have to understand, and we have to make people understand that whenever you're challenging something, we're not challenging the individual or their authority necessarily, but we're challenging a preconception or an ideal that could be wrong or could use improvement. And challenges have a place. I know you're a space fan, and I'm sure many of our listeners are as well too. Kennedy challenged the nation to say, we will go to the moon in 10 years. It was a challenge that he issued. He dropped the gauntlet. And so people had an opportunity to be able to follow through on that opportunity.
Yeah, because they bought into the goal, and he involved people in such a way that they would feel that it was part of their mission, their personal life mission. It was not just his mission.
And I think that's the big thing, is whenever you're working for something that is beyond yourself, people will want to contribute. They will want to pay attention, and they're going to follow the mission. And they're going to be able to lend additional weight to it. If you look at the greatest successes, it's because people want to believe. They want to give into it. They want to give themselves over to the cause, and they give more to it because they're engaged.
So it sounds like a lot of the job of a leader is to respect the followers and give credibility to their ideas and encourage them to think for themselves and that sort of thing. And I'm thinking of my particular role as a public speaker in space exploration. Mm-hmm. I don't want to just tell people, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it. It sounds like I should be trying to encourage them as followers to come up with their own ideas.
Well, absolutely. I mean, people are wanting to be inspired. Mm-hmm. Now, leadership has an opportunity to be able to provide some of that. Mm-hmm. But I would say that greater inspiration will come when people find it within themselves. Mm-hmm. So I'm not suggesting you set people on fire, but if you can light that spark within them, they can tend that fire and have it grow.
Yeah. I'm going to have to think about how I can do that in my speeches. So can you give me an example of a successful application of followership in an organization?
I can think of an organizational point of view, and I can think of a family point of view. I'll start with the family.
Okay.
So I've got 2 young children, 8 and 6. Mm-hmm. Now, we're at that awkward cusp now where I would like them to read more. Usually we do bedtime stories. It's one of the greatest part of my day. It's one of the few things I excel at as a father, I think, is I can do story time relatively well.
Yeah.
And we're getting to the point now where we need to start transitioning a little bit more. So this way the children can read to me. So we'll share some of that responsibility. Now, as a leader, as the dad, I could read the story. Yeah. I could have my child read me the story. Now, this is where following comes in very challengingly. As the person who can actually read, who's fully literate, well, I'll say fully literate, I have an opportunity to be able to say, well, that's what the word is. Mm-hmm. Or I can sit back, even though I'm the dad, I'm the leader, and I can follow my child's direction. Because they may say, I don't know this word. I can choose to just tell them what it is, or I can follow their lead to have them sound it out. Mm-hmm. And that's the empowering part. So it's a great shift of the balance that we have in that.
So that's not the old style leadership at all.
No, it's not command and control. And I think that still certainly has its place. Whenever you look at emergency situations, you want the person who knows what's going on and how to control a situation to take care of it. And that, I think, has a great value, and I want to make sure that we understand that.
Yeah, like a lifeguard rescuing somebody.
And the military is a great example. But even in the military, there is a allowance that if you are given an unjust or an illegal order, you have an obligation not to follow it.
As a follower,
Absolutely. Yeah. Same thing in the medical field. Followership has, there's been some research and some publications about if you, let's say, were a nurse and I'm a doctor, and I say, I want you to give this patient this prescription. You know the patient better than I do. You have an obligation not to administer that if you know it will do harm. So in a command and control, in a blindless automaton lemming state, you would do it. And then where would that obligation last? Who did it? Well, I did it as the doctor, but you also allowed it to happen.
So is there legal ramifications of a follower following orders that kill somebody in the case of medical that they should have objected to, but can they just simply say, I was following orders? Or are they actually held responsible as a follower to basically defend what they should have known?
Yes, there are actual precedents of that. Now, the one that I think that stands out in my mind is probably the most extreme example. Let's say if you're an accountant. If you're an accountant, what's your culpability if something happens where you work? Well, in one case, it was several 100,000 cases of murder, as a matter of fact. Whoa. So there was a British gentleman who was charged for being an accomplice to murder for being an accountant at one of the death camps during World War II. There was over 100,000 counts that he was found guilty of.
But he could just say, I'm following orders.
And that is the challenge that is being put before us in some cases. Now, again, that is a very extreme example, and most of us are not going to be faced with that type of challenge. But that is a prime example about how we are now questioning the blind leadership that people say, well, I was just doing what I was told. You have an obligation not to follow, to object in those cases. And it exists all over the world. If you look at what's going on right now, we had the Arab Spring, the Me Too movement, Occupy Wall Street, what's going on in Hong Kong. Yes, there are individuals who are taking a certain amount of responsibility. Those are leaders. But everyone is following the cause. They are following what is right. And I think that is something that we need to spend greater time on and acknowledging the value of those individuals as followers. It's not the leaders who are there, because if it was just the leaders, there'd be a handful of people. It is the droves that come out who are going out and not looking for an individual to lead them, but to be part of that movement.
That's really interesting, because when I was in the military, part of our officer training was, in fact, leadership training. And we would take turns being leaders of the platoon, and we'd go out and do various exercises. But I suppose they were probably also evaluating us on followership, if they were smart, to see if indeed, do we enable the leader? Do we enable the group? Or did we just simply act as robots? You know?
And I think one of the things that you said there was great is the word enable. Because by being somebody who's part of a group, you enable the group to continue to exist. If you don't believe in the direction of, let's say, the President of the United States, what is your obligation then? Is your obligation then to the office of the presidency? Is it to the president himself or herself? Is it to be able to say, I do not agree with the policies, I do not agree with the politics, but I still believe in the nation that I am part of. What can I do to still strengthen within that organization? And I think that's something that is perhaps lacking in so many ways. A lot of people like to complain and lament as opposed to actively, positively engaging.
It sounds to me like you have experts within a government, let's say in military or in climate science or all kinds of different areas. Then if they see that their leaders are taking them in the wrong direction, then it sounds like from the followership point of view, they have an obligation, even ethical and probably to some extent legal, to say to their leader, no, we should not be invading that country. Even though some people might say, no, the leader makes the choice, the military always just do it. But in fact, it sounds like the responsibility also lies on the followers to, if they're experts in the field, to speak out and say, look, this is a mistake.
Well, absolutely. And you can see that even, let's say, in legislation when it comes to whistleblowing. I mean, there is an allowance to be able to say, you know what, this is something that we believe is wrong. We need to step up and we need to announce that to people. And there are ways to do it. There are appropriate ways and there can be inappropriate ways. But that's, I think, something that we need to understand. We need to empower people to understand, both as individuals, as organizations, and within that individual aspect, you as a follower, and then you somebody in the authoritative role of manager, boss, leader, as it were.
Because it's interesting, so often the excuse is made, well, so-and-so works for the government, so they have to do and say what the government wants them to do and say. But it's not that simple, is it? I mean, if they're truly an expert in a particular field and their specialist knowledge tells them that the government's going in the wrong direction, should they be speaking out in public, do you think? Or should they obviously try and solve it internally first? But in the final analysis, if they know something wrong is being done, do you think they have an obligation to speak out in public?
I think that belongs to the individual moral code. We have people who have gone to certain extremes, and those could be viewed in the cases of, let's say, Assange, Snowden. There's another individual who was recently pardoned. I forget, she was a U.S. military official. I forget her name, unfortunately. And those were people who took it upon themselves to say, what is the proper course of action for themselves? If you've exhausted every and all opportunities within an organization that you are part of, then perhaps you need to question whether you should continue to be part of that organization.
Right, and then you can resign and then from the outside criticize and say what's ethical and honest. But to actually stay in the organization and not speak out is a problem if you're an expert and you know what's wrong.
And I think it's up to the individual to see what change they can muster within.
Yeah, exactly. So this whole concept of followership, I find, is quite intriguing because it means that the individual then has a responsibility to learn more about the mission that they're engaged in. In other words, it would be easy to say, I don't know. Well, for example, if you're supporting the light rail transit system, okay, and you're working for a public relations firm, it sounds like you have an obligation to actually learn if this is the right project for the city.
Absolutely.
Rather than simply carry out the communications. And that is interesting because communications companies, as Joseph knows, they promote everything from soup to nuts. And so often I've heard people that work for communications companies, I would ask them, do you think that this message is correct? They would say, I don't know. I'm just a communications person. But that's not adequate, is it?
Well, and this is where you need to understand what your values are as an individual. And I think that some of us are very fortunate. We can actually pair our values with our employment opportunities. Other people, they have to make harder decisions. If you look at some of the opportunities that people have, they're limited. And if they have a greater value, let's say, placed on taking care of family concerns, taking care of other social welfare aspects that they're focused on, then they have to balance, well, what's the greater good for that individual?
Yeah, that's right. And sometimes it has to be just to maintain their salary for now.
And sanity in some cases as well. And so that's, again, going back to the follower idea. What do they choose to follow? Are they following the political aspect that they're interested in? Is there another means to an ends that they're considering, or do they understand this is something that I need to do because there's a greater value that I am actually engaging in?
So what should this accountant during the Nazi regime, what should he have done?
Well, and this would be something that we could have a great length of conversation about. I mean, I'm a big fan of the movie Schindler's List. There could be an opportunity there where perhaps there could be something to do internally. But again, flip side is why did it get that far? Why did the populace allow it to happen?
Too many blind followers.
Perhaps, yes.
Yeah.
If there was a greater engagement before the Third Reich came on, maybe there's something else that could have been done in the populace.
So it sounds like politicians who object to people who object are actually off base. I mean, they should be encouraging people to think for themselves.
Absolutely.
Instead of trying to dismiss them, push them away, because ideally a politician is representing the whole population, not just those who agree with their immediate policy. So I think that, when I look at different ministers of the crown, I won't name any in particular right now, but the demonizing of people who don't agree with you but have an honest ethical intent, that's a mistake. To be demonizing people because they don't agree and to dismiss them and to, basically engage in name calling, which is what we see. It sounds like that's a huge mistake.
I think that there's a great opportunity to attack a position, not a person. I think that's something that is really lacking in the discourse that we have today. Years ago in the political sphere, people understood that we still had to get along. I forget the...
Ben Franklin was great at that, trying to get the two sides to work together.
Yeah. And there was, I forget the gentleman's name, he was always fighting Reagan. And at one point he had called Reagan something particularly unsettling, so Reagan called him up and said, I thought, Joe, we were friends. He's like, well, we are, only after 5 p.m. And so I think the challenge there is understanding that just because we don't have the same beliefs on certain key issues, it doesn't mean that the greater belief we have isn't the same. You and I, let's say, for instance, we both believe in Canada.
Yeah.
I don't think we'd argue with that.
No.
Maybe what we agree on would differ, though, on how to make Canada great or to continue its greatness. But that doesn't mean that I think any less of your end goal. It's just perhaps the means. And I think that's where we have that opportunity, again, to have those conversations, particularly where we don't agree. And if we can have it a proper discourse.
Well, also, I mean, if we don't agree, there might be reasons that can help sway my opinion. I think that this is there was a saying, I can't remember who said it, but a fairly famous person, he said, my opinion is based on on these facts, and if the facts change or I learn more, I can change my opinion. So you're not married to the opinion. The opinion is only a function of what you know, and you can learn more from people that disagree with you than people who just nod in unison.
Absolutely.
So if you were thinking of getting out and teaching people about followership, what would you do?
Well, one of the biggest things I'd want to do is I would want to bring people together to have a conversation, understand the value of being a follower, and understanding what they can do to be the best follower that they can be. Now, sometimes this is going to be great to be able to have an opportunity where I speak with you, and then we can broadcast it out to the world. Other times, if I have an opportunity to be able to engage one-on-one, then I can coach, I can mentor, and I actually am fortunate enough that I do that with several people now. But I would love to be able to do that and expose people just to the ideas of it. And I'm hoping maybe someday I'll be able to do that, which is one of the reasons why I've joined Toastmasters and how I actually come to meet you, Tom.
Yeah. So if you had the ideal environment in which to teach this, would it be at a corporate meeting? Would it be at a conference in front of people that are specialized in certain fields? Where would you go?
Well, I think it would depend primarily on what people want to learn and how they want to learn. At a conference, it's a great opportunity. If we can do, let's say, smaller workshops, there's so much more that can be learned when we do it together. Other times, it will have to come down to that opportunity to be able to broadcast, to be able to begin the conversation. So if that means I have to talk all by myself for 40 minutes in front of a crowd of 100, 200, 1,000 people, broadcasting to the world digitally, I think that's a good place to start. And if people want to engage even further and follow what I have to say, well, I would be happy to encourage them to do that.
Yeah, great. It sounds like you should write some newspaper articles about this.
Well, I'd be certainly willing to have them published at some point if I can get the time.
I'll talk to you more about that offline because it's not that hard to get published, actually. Now, concerning Toastmasters, I mean, Toastmasters have followers and leaders, so it sounds like that's also a good environment in which to encourage followership.
Well, absolutely. And I think that's something that really speaks to me. So, as you know, Tom, I've been a club president twice now. I've been involved with the executive every year up till recently.
Yeah, we should just say the club name just to give them good PR. I'm the vice president of PR, so I got to make sure it gets in there. It's the Constellation Toastmasters Club at the Nepean City Hall Center Point, and I'm a member, and I'm the VP of Public Relations now. Haha. But Nick was our previous president.
And I think one of the things that's very interesting when it comes to being involved with that organization is you want to be able to do what you can to inspire leadership within the club. But as club president, my biggest thing was to follow what our members wanted. I could have just said, this is the way we're going forward. And then maybe I'd have 3 or 4 people who would be very interested in that. And then the rest, unfortunately, would fall to the side. But instead, if I want to engage the people that we had as club members and get them to have the most they possibly can out of it, that's where I should be listening. So even though I have the responsibility and role and title of club president, I'm not dictating what we're going to be doing. I'm going to be listening to the constructive criticism and opportunity that we have, which is the whole point behind Toastmasters, is the constructive criticism.
Yeah, because if you haven't enabled club members to take part and carry out the roles and actually engage in their own learning and progress, then what's the point?
Absolutely.
So that surely is one of your main jobs, is to enable the followers to follow their dream and to also do it in such a way that they succeed.
And I think as we move forward in this, the 21st century that we're coming into, it's a very unique place. I mean, if you look at what leadership has done to the 20th century and how that's changed the world, I really do feel that followership is poised to change the 21st century in the same type of way and beyond as well.
So if you were advising an individual on how to be an effective follower, what kind of training or mindset would you encourage them to take?
One of the biggest things that I would encourage somebody to do is to have themselves answer the hard questions they would ask of someone else. Right now, I work in an organization where our director believes that if somebody's going to come forward with a opportunity for change, we'll say, or complaint is what most people would call it, that they need to also come up with a resolution for it.
Makes
and
sense.
I like that idea. But at the same time, I think it also is putting a lot of weight on people. Now, in some cases, people want to be able to bring forward a concern and have the leader step up. Now, as a follower, where does that leave you? And I think that's something that people need to reconcile is, what do we have as a responsibility for ourselves as well as those people that are supposed to lead us through those challenges?
So the leaders need to, it's funny because I think back to a number of my bosses where they would look on it as a challenge to their authority or even to them personally if you came up with a solution to a problem that you brought up. Whereas, in fact, a good leader who is enabling their followers should not just allow, but encourage them to come up with suggestions for change or improvement.
Well, absolutely. I think that I guess an elephant in the room when it comes to all this in some degree is we're mortal. At some point, our time in an organization will pass. And if we really truly believe in that organization and the people we are working with, we should do everything we can to ensure the longevity of that organization and the careers of those around us.
Yeah, exactly.
And putting people down and preventing them from being able to succeed inhibits that from happening.
Well, I think it also generates a lot of fear so that people are afraid to give suggestions. They're afraid to do anything more than just nod in unison, yes, sir, and then you can find out later after a project has totally failed that there was knowledge within that group that could have made it succeed, but they were intimidated, they were afraid. And that fear aspect surely is something that is a challenge for leaders to get away from when they're encouraging their followers to contribute.
I mean, that's why there's a negative aspect with the idea of being called a yes man. You don't want that. You want, the occasional no man. You want the, well, maybe. And I think that's something, again, that we can look at individually and how we can bring more to the table.
Yeah. Is there anything that we can read to start to get up to speed on this area?
One of the best writers right now that I've come across is Barbara Kellerman. Now, she proposes that the leadership industry is bloated, billions of dollars being spent. And she has a couple of great books, unfortunately the names escape me right now, that really kind of track the course of human history in regards to leadership and how we were on an original trajectory and how we're lessening the role of the leader and increasing the value of the follower.
Now, after this interview, when it's put online, we can actually put a link underneath our interview. Would you think you can find a link that we could put on?
I'm sure I could find several.
Yeah, okay, that would be good. So people can actually look under the audio and see some things to read to learn more about followership. So it was great to have you in, Nick. I really appreciate it. And this is opening a new door for me into something that I think subconsciously thought was important, but now really know is critical for the 21st century. So thank you very much, and good to have you in.
Thank you very much, Tom. It's been a pleasure.
So that's all for this week, and I hope you tune in next week for another interesting episode of Exploratory Journeys. Tom Harris, signing out.